Hello everyone, welcome back. You're watching Empyrion Galactic Survival episode 163. I'm Enigmius and today we're continuing with the Copperhead hover vessel build. Last episode we spent a lot of time on the top section of the ship and working on the hull weave sort of design, the pattern that we've got laid out here with the wall blocks to make things look kind of interesting and unique, I guess you could say. That left us with the inside and the underside of the ship to take care of, and that's kind of what I've been working on up to this point. I did some things behind the scenes, so today we're going to look at what I did on the underside, and then we're going to take a look in the inside, and then we're going to do a time-lapse segment continuing with the inside because it's by no means near completion, although we'll take a big chunk off of that today. As far as the underside goes, I just basically took that same pattern, the exact same pattern that we were looking at in the last episode, and duplicated it on the underside, and you can see we've got a combination of the flat black and orange that we've been using up to this point, and then right in the middle we've got this section that's white on the edges and dark gray on the flat sections, and it's the same texture as we were using before. It's glossy on the edges and flat on the large surfaces. And the reason why I did that is I got to thinking that the underside of a snake is usually white. Not to say it's always white, but it might even be more accurate to say it's usually a lighter color than the top side of the snake. So I kind of decided, just for the sake of a little bit of variety, that I would run with that and just kind of have this little section on the underside taken care of with that specific color combination. And one of the things that I found is that when you start looking at the white from different angles, here it's pretty obvious that it's white. Here, where you get some weird shading going on, it almost looks silver. So there's this weird metallic thing happening on our ship, and it's not a bad thing. I really quite like the way that it looks, and I'm thinking of actually calling it silver when describing it, but you know, just for the sake of being specific and sharing with you guys what's going on, I'm using the actual colors that I used. I also created an opening that will serve as the entrance for the ship, or at the very least the primary entrance, and it'll have a ramp to make it a little bit easier to jump up onto. It's very elevated off the ground, and that's kind of been the goal from the very beginning, but it means getting a ramp or stairs or something right down to the ground level is really not practical. You can imagine it would have to come down around here, several ramps coming down around here, and I just wasn't interested in doing it that way. But I did do some testing with the jetpack jumping up to see if there would be any problems getting in, and the ramp really makes it a lot easier. The shape of this sort of hollowed out section also supports making it easier to jump up onto the ramp, and unless you're on a planet with really nasty gravity, I think this should be adequate in most cases to be able to get up into the ship. We've got the manual type doors. There are no automatic doors for small vessels or hover vessels, at least none that I know of. And realistically speaking, you don't need much more than that. There's an element of protection here because once again, we ended up in a situation where we've got the core is right here for the ship, and you can't actually... Yeah, I took all the generators out when I moved everything around, so if you're having a hard time seeing it, that's the best that I can do for you. Maybe that's a little bit better. You can see the core, you get the idea where it is relative to the entrance to the ship. And again, not wanting to create a situation where all it takes is someone to place an explosive on the inside of that little hollowed out section and have immediate and easy access to the core. So what I did was I built this out in a way that it's supposed to look kind of interesting, and it'll look even better when it's properly lit, when the core is lit up inside. But it's all actually filled in with blocks. There's no empty spaces in this structure. So whoever wants to try and go for the easy route to the core is going to have to do a little bit of work for it before they'll be able to get that access. And hopefully you're around to kind of protect the ship. There's also going to be some minigun turrets on the underside of the ship to prevent people from having that opportunity in the first place. So one way or the other, the placement of the core I think is going to be okay. Not necessarily my first choice, but could also be a lot worse. I've done some of the interior work here looking around, you can see there's not many of those blue textured blocks left. I kind of went around and filled things in. This area, for example, you can kind of get the idea relative to how rough it was in the past, that there's been some effort put into getting things taken care of. There's quite a lot of armor in a lot of spots on the ship now. If you were to try and dig your way through, in most cases you'd have to go through 3 or 4 different blocks before you could get to the outside. Or conversely, you'd have to go through 3 or 4 blocks to get to the inside. This is what I'm referring to when I say there's lots of stuff that we have left to do to finish it off. We're going to get to that time-lapse segment momentarily, but the last thing I just wanted to show you, and this was something that I probably could have done as part of the time-lapse, but I was in here and I was kind of mucking about, filling things in, and I just started working on it, and I kind of got carried away and wound up finishing the interior wall for the cockpit area. And it turned out, I think, rather well. The most recent patch to the game that just came out in the last day or two changed the texture on this default small vessel, hover vessel, hardened steel. No, this is hardened steel, the basic steel texture. It's a little bit cleaner. It's got the shiny sort of thing going on, the same as the glossy texture, and it's just got these different lines and things going on. I really like it. I actually like it a great deal, and I think, because this is an example of things that don't necessarily carry forward, this is the new one that we just got, and this is, I think, the old one. Yes. So you can see the old one was similar in theme. It had sort of a glossy texture, and it had the lines, but they were all scuffed up around the edges, and it wasn't quite so clean in this area either. But now the new one is very clean and very shiny. So we still have the old one as an alternate if we want to select it, but the default for the steel is now this, and I quite think that it's going to be useful in a lot of different builds, just because a clean, shiny ship, when it's brand new and first built, it's always not necessarily a bad thing to have. So the next thing that we need to do, in addition to smoothing out the rest of the interior, is following through with my promise to make sure that whatever we ended up doing with glass on the interior of the ship, we were going to make sure that we built the structure around it in such a way that it wasn't going to be an easy shot to go through the glass and then start, for example, shooting at the core. We have to make sure that that's not really an option for people who have things on their mind other than our best interests. So we're going to spend a little bit of time on that. We're going to spend a little bit of time cleaning things up, getting them ready, and then it'll be mostly a matter of putting in all the equipment and then going around and doing any final tweaks and changes leading up to completion of the ship. So let's get after the time-lapse bit, and then we'll see what we've got when we're done. When it comes to sorting out interiors, I've found there's really 2 different ways to go about it. One is to kind of take a look at what's there, smooth out the profiles a little bit, and then work in the blocks to kind of make it look less blocky, sort of like what we're doing now. And the end result is something that has sort of a layered effect. You can see distinct layers. There's really not a lot of effort put into making those layers line up in any specific way. It's just kind of take what you can get and put it together and get it done. And this is basically the approach that I'm taking here. And just like I was doing with some of the things on the outside as well, I'm trying to practice getting in the habit of, wherever possible, using one specific block in all of the places where I need to before I switch to something else, just to save a little bit of time. It's easier to do in a situation like this where you can kind of anticipate where you're going to need to put things. It's not as easy to do when you've got basically just an idea in your head and you're trying to manipulate it into the game. In this particular situation, the interior of a hover vessel that's this size, I'm not really too worried about conserving space. It's not really something that I feel I need to do. There's a certain line of thought that says every block you place is more armor and potentially can save you from a catastrophe. There's the other kind of school of thought that says every block you place is modifying the handling characteristics of the vehicle by adding mass, and consequently maybe it's a good idea to keep an eye on what you're using, where and how often. I feel pretty confident that we've got enough space on this vessel to have all of the thrusters we could possibly need, all of the hover engines that we could possibly need, and all of the generators and fuel tanks that we would need to keep them going. So we're taking a chance that we're not going to cross into some sort of diminishing returns category with critical things like hover engines and maneuverability, being able to turn the ship left and right, specifically on a hover vessel. Obviously with a hover vessel you're not worried about the pitch so much, although I would say a lot of the fun with a powerful hover vessel is launching yourself over cliffs, and in that case getting up the hills quite often, being able to tilt the nose back is quite an asset. But realistically speaking, it's not too much of a concern. The majority of the concern, and what I look at when I first fire up the vessel, is left and right movement to see whether or not it's responsive or if it's kind of sluggish. I'm not sure how we're going to end up in that category with this vessel. It is my largest hover vessel by quite a substantial margin, so we'll just have to wait and see. Of course, we're working with mirror mode just to save a little bit of time. I find that working indoors with mirror mode in a ship this large is actually better than working outdoors with it, because if you need to make changes, you don't have to go very far on the other side to remove any blocks that you've already removed on the side that you're working with. The downside is that when you get into some of the tighter areas with the mirror mode, sometimes that green mesh itself is kind of an obstruction, I found, in certain situations. You won't really see too much of it here, but maybe a little bit later you'll see that. And it's just one of those things, kind of working through the process and learning what works for me and what doesn't. And that was definitely something that stood out as a bit of a nuisance, was just the tight quarters. And that was the kind of situation where we're talking about mirror mode adding one extra block because you're not placing a whole lot at such a small space. So I could have turned it off and probably had a much better outcome. And this is coming to, I think, a reasonable example, in case I wasn't clear what I'm referring to about layers. We just finished that top layer, we got it all filled in, and now we're kind of working our way through the next layer down, trying to come up with a kind of shape that's going to support the layers below. One of the things that I've noticed, one of the things that I came across as I was doing this, is that there were certain cases where the layers did line up in certain specific situations and in certain areas, which wasn't necessarily to say that it was good that they were lining up, because we have intersections of various different things and it can end up looking very cluttered if they don't come together properly. So there was a certain amount of time spent on this reworking in order to hopefully ensure that we don't have that issue, things of overlapping in ways that don't necessarily work. It doesn't really take a long time to do this. I think the total time spent recording this was 50 minutes from start to finish, and then there was obviously time saved by speeding it up, and also time saved editing out all of the selection menus. And I also, whenever I did a rework of a particular section, I just basically, I'm showing you the rework. I'm not actually showing you the process of removing all of the blocks, because there were a couple of situations where I removed quite a few. So there's time saved there, not showing you that process. It doesn't really strike me as being the most important thing that I can do on a ship, but at the same time, in the vessels where I haven't really invested a lot of time on the interior and specifically smoothing things off and giving a little bit of thought to the end result, I've always felt like they were just a little bit less than they could have been. So on a ship this size, where we haven't really been, we haven't spent a ton of time on it up to this point, we've invested time in it and come up with some things that I think are kind of fun and interesting, but we haven't spent anywhere near, for example, the amount of time that we spent on the Heracles. That was an extremely long build, and by the end of it, I was feeling like, as far as the interior goes, less is more. Like, we'll just get it done to a reasonable standard. Then if people want more, they can add more, but I wasn't necessarily looking to do a 100% detailed finished interior. This is a little bit different because we haven't spent that time on it. It's not really to the point where I'm starting to feel the itch to move on to something else. I'm just kind of working my way through it, and it's still, you know, having a lot of fun with it. It's not tedious yet, I guess you could say. And in this case, we managed to finish it out in a way that I'm pretty happy with. But there was one other thing that I wanted to approach in this episode, and that was the barrier between the front cockpit and the rest of the interior. Because we've got all of that glass in the front, it was really important to me to make sure that we weren't giving people, like as I mentioned, giving people an opportunity to just basically punch a hole in the glass and then go hog wild on the interior of the ship. It's just, that would be a little bit too far on the side of poor design, I think, because I saw the problem or the potential for the problem, and I felt that it was significant. Choosing not to do anything about it just maybe isn't the approach that I would have been happy with in the long term. So I decided that I would include, as part of the design, measures such as this, which is basically a wall that extends around that cockpit section, closes it in, but doesn't really slow you down all that much getting into it. There's a door that we'll be placing that will allow you to get in and out. It's a wide door. Well, I mean, it's the only door that you can have on a hover vessel, so it's the same size as all of the other doors, but it's not like a narrow opening like I've done in the past, where it's just basically a 1 block wide and 2 or 3 blocks high. And the reason is because those little narrow openings, much as they're convenient, you don't have to worry about hitting a button to open the door. They're problematic when the vessel isn't sitting on a level surface, because the vessel's floor will be wonky, but the game considers you to be straight up and down, and consequently sometimes those little narrow openings don't work. You can't get through them. So that's why I chose to put a door where I did. And then there's a little bit of a foyer when you first enter this cockpit area that again sort of closes off that section. So even if the door is open, you still have to shoot through a certain amount of armor before you can get to that open hole. So it's not super clever. I'm not trying to sell it as this great fantastic design that's going to change the way people think about cockpits, but it is, there was a certain amount of thought that went into it, specifically for the purpose of making it do what we needed it to do without being too much of an obstruction. So you can see there's the door. You come in, you've got that wall basically directly in front of you. You have to go around it, and then we'll have the cockpit sitting on top of that in a way that you can access it from the floor, even if you're in like crazy ridiculous gravity and for whatever reason can't jump up on that platform with your jetpack. You can still toggle the cockpit, enter the cockpit from the floor, and carry on and do what you need to do. So we've got the majority of the front cockpit done. We've got the interior of the ship done, as far as the where the exterior hull meets the interior, I guess is one way of saying it. But we still have to place all the equipment. We still have to place all the thrusters, the hover engines, the boosters, all that other stuff. And we're going to probably take a look at that in the next episode. And then after that, we'd be looking towards the blueprint. So we're not too far away from the blueprint. And we're just going to keep at it until we're there. So if you want to be notified about the next and future episodes in the series, the easiest way to do that is to follow me on, to subscribe to my channel on YouTube, or follow me on social media. Links for social media are always in the information section below the video. Feel free to leave your comments and feedback. Thanks for watching, guys, and take care.